Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to this update on the forecast for severe weather today, Saturday, April 27th. Back in Norman today as we have what is shaping up to be a potentially significant, intense severe weather outbreak across the central and southern plains. The SPC has upgraded to a moderate risk level 4 out of 5 for parts of southeast Kansas, much of the central corridor of Oklahoma, down into northwest Texas in the red shaded region here. Large enhanced and slight risk areas surrounding that. A very broad severe weather risk today from the Great Lakes down into southwest Texas. But again, that main corridor for a potential severe weather outbreak today is going to be focused on that southeast Kansas to northwest Texas corridor. All hazards are on the table for today. That tornado risk is extremely elevated today. 15% hashed risk area within the moderate risk, surrounded by a large 10% hashed risk area in the yellow stippled region here. That includes places like Kansas City, Wichita, down toward Abilene, Dallas, Fort Worth in that 10 hashed area. And then we get into the 15 hashed area, the greatest threat for strong long track tornadoes. SPC using some pretty intense wording in their outlook. You can see here the potential for long track EF2 to EF3 plus tornadoes. So tornado threat is no joke today. Highest in this corridor in the red stippled region here, including places like Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Norman, smack dab in the middle of that risk. Lawton, Fort Sill, Wichita Falls in that greatest level 4 out of 5 moderate risk and this 15% hashed tornado risk. Large hail going to be a threat today. There is going to be a period during the early afternoon where storms will be capable of producing large to giant hail, particularly in this pink stippled region here, a 45% hashed risk area from southeast Kansas down into northwest Texas, including much of Oklahoma, for significant hail-producing supercells, with 15 and 30% hashed areas stretching all the way up into the central plains, Midwest, down into southwest Texas. So large to very large hail to giant hail on the table for today, and damaging winds, particularly in the moderate risk corridor, going to be a threat as well. Perhaps significant damaging winds, especially as we go toward the evening. So a very potent severe weather outbreak setting up for today. We know this day, it has been historically a pretty active day, April 27th, and today looks to be no exception to that. We do have a risk out for tomorrow, broad slight risk from the Midwest down into west or east Texas, with an all hazards threat there, tornadoes, damaging wind, and large hail. Not going to talk about tomorrow in this video. Need to focus on today's highly elevated risk here across the central and southern plains. So we are going to focus on today's risk in this video. And it is a complex risk. So let's go ahead and dive right into some of the observed data that we're seeing right now. Let's first show you what's going on right now as we have a tornado watch that is out for parts of western Oklahoma into northwest Texas. And we do have some storms that are already firing within this tornado watch, starting to get some supercell characteristics here in the southeast Texas panhandle, additional development to the south and east here across western Oklahoma down into the Texas South Plains. This is expected to be round one of today's setup. This convection is expected to intensify and increase in coverage going into the morning and early afternoon hours as it spreads off to the northeast. And this could pose an all hazards threat going into the morning hours today, the next several hours, as these storms perk up. They are struggling a little bit at the moment. There is probably a little bit of capping in place across this region, but these storms are expected to increase in both coverage and intensity going into the next several hours, and they could foster that all hazards threat, including the threat for a few tornadoes here this morning into early afternoon. Then south of this activity, we're going to see some sort of outflow, perhaps from this activity or a differential heating boundary, and that could serve as a corridor for enhanced low-level shear, enhanced dynamics, setting up somewhere here from the northwest Texas corridor into central and northern Oklahoma, into southern Kansas, for a corridor within which we could see that threat for significant long-track tornadic supercells, and I suspect it will be oriented fairly well with respect to the storm motion and flow aloft, to allow for some storms to ride along that corridor and become fairly significant. And that could set up right over central Oklahoma, which does include the Oklahoma City metro area. Certainly a chase day where I'll be taking my important documents and such with me because the central Oklahoma area is going to be right in the heart of this significant severe weather risk for today. We can see as we go to the satellite data here, this is our water vapor satellite imagery. I don't usually show this anymore. I used to show it in old videos, but it is kind of important for today to show you what is causing this morning round. You can see this little area of high clouds here moving across West Texas and initiating those storms ahead of it. This is a little bit of an embedded shortwave that is rotating through the flow, and that is helping to kick off these storms this morning, and will continue those storms into the afternoon. Before we get our main trough, you see this huge swirl out here back to the west. That is our big old trough here that will begin to move off to the, will continue to move off to the east today and be our impetus on the synoptic scale for severe weather this afternoon. We go to our upper air maps and you can see where that trough is located. Very high amplitude, deep trough here across the western half of the U.S. Subtly negatively tilted at this point. If we were to draw the axis in there, leaning back to the left a little bit, so slightly negatively tilted, going to continue that way in somewhat of a neutral to negative tilt fashion going into the afternoon. And a big difference with this setup versus a lot of the setups this year has been that this trough is going to be timed very well with daytime heating to allow storms to go along our various boundaries going into the afternoon hours. With some of these previous setups, for example, a couple days ago on Thursday, the trough was very poorly timed for dryline development. The trough axis was lagging well back to the west back here. The main forcing for ascent with the trough was not going to arrive until evening, and therefore we didn't see much dryline activity there on Thursday across parts of that 10-hatch disk in Kansas down into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. And when they did develop, they were not all that great because we just didn't have the forcing to urge those storms along that dry line. So that is not going to be the case today. This trough is very well timed. We're going to see this forcing this leading edge of the stronger flow already starting to impinge upon the region, but this leading edge of the strongest belt of flow here already in the central Texas panhandle, going to move off to the east and northeast with time, and that will overspread the warm sector by early to mid-afternoon and allow for that second round of storms to initiate along our various boundaries. So plenty of forcing for ascent today. Beautiful textbook-looking trough here, and the trough is actually going to be imparting its influence on the region, whereas with the last several of the last few setups, that has not been the case as the trough has been delayed. So optimal forcing for ascent today with a very textbook geometry to this mid and upper level trough. We go down to the surface, and we have started to see secondary surface cyclogenesis here across the southeast Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas panhandle vicinity here this morning. Broad surface cyclone at this point, but it is expected to tighten up here as we go into the afternoon hours as we really get that trough, that stronger flow associated with this secondary trough, second trough to move across the Rockies. Our first trough has ejected all the way up here into the Great Lakes region this morning, and that was associated with our severe threat Thursday and yesterday, which ended up being very significant across eastern Nebraska into western Iowa in particular. That trough moving off to the northeast, that is going to continue to move off to the northeast today. And so forcing for ascent is going to be limited, at least on the synoptic scale, the large scale for these areas up here in the slight risk from Nebraska, northern Missouri into Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. There is that slight risk that does extend up there, but it is not going to be all that potent as we don't have a lot of large scale forcing for ascent, and the forcing is going to come from the boundary, the surface front that will be stalled along this corridor going into the afternoon hours today. So we don't really have a lot of large-scale forcing for ascent here, but convergence along the frontal boundary should be enough to get a few storms to go up there with an all-hazards threat. But again, ahead of our main trough is going to be where this outbreak is, the main crux of the outbreak is expected to take place. Let's go down to 850 millibars here, and we can see a very broad, strong, low-level jet this morning from all the way up from the Great Lakes down into the southern plains. Tight cyclone up here associated with that first mid and upper level trough. That is going to continue to move off to the northeast, with it going to allow that low-level jet perhaps to wane a little bit going into the next several hours. So initially, these storms forming in the eastern Texas panhandle will be perhaps having a threat for a few tornadoes, but that will wane with time with this first round, as low-level shear probably will decline a little bit until that forcing for ascent and the stronger flow aloft really starts to overtake the Rockies, and we start to see significant surface cyclogenesis here in southeast Kansas, or southwest Kansas, southeast Colorado, somewhere in that vicinity by this afternoon. In between these 2 points this morning, when we have that remnant low-level jet here, and when that low-level flow really starts to crank up this afternoon, we'll probably see a little bit of a lull in tornadic activity and mostly a large hail threat, and that will encompass this second round of storms, which should begin about early to mid-afternoon as that forcing starts to overspread the region here. That will allow for a large to very large hail threat initially with this second round of storms here across southeast Kansas down into northwest Texas. And then we will see a ramp up in low-level flow going into the mid to late afternoon hours, which is when we'll see that tornado and significant tornado threat ramp up, as coincident with this surface low and low-level cyclone really starting to ramp up going into the next several hours. We'll look at some model data here in just a second to see how that progresses, but that's kind of what the idea with how the low-level flow is expected to progress going into the afternoon with this event. Here is our raw surface data here. And you can see a very broad warm sector already in place across this region. You can see where that front is located. Right in here, you see the wind shift, especially across Nebraska into Kansas. A little bit of a wind shift right in this vicinity here. Actually, perhaps it's somewhere in this vicinity right in here. Got a little bit excited there, put the front in the wrong place, but it's probably somewhere right in here. That will probably stall out going into the afternoon, probably a little bit of motion at the moment. May retreat a little bit farther to the north as well going into the afternoon hours up here into southeast Nebraska, central Iowa, northeastward. And so we'll probably see as this surface low develops and tightens here in southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, Texas Panhandle vicinity, that surface low will start to move off to the north ever so slightly before stalling out a little bit going into the afternoon hours. That will be our main impetus for storms here with northeast extent into Iowa, up into the Great Lakes region. Down here to the south, the warm front will constitute that northern extent of the severe threat, and it is expected to be a broad severe threat. Lots of real estate for severe storms to work with today. You can see we have a dry line that is in place across this region. Clear dew point gradient here, 30s, 40s, 20s even here across the Texas Panhandle, with mid to upper 60s here to the east across much of Oklahoma. So our dry line is already in place this morning, located somewhere in this vicinity here, and that is expected to continue to tighten up and move off to the east perhaps a little bit today before retreating back west, which is a typical motion for these dry lines. But you can see south of this front and east of the dry line, a very warm, moist air mass here. Mid to upper 60s dew points across a broad swath from Texas into Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, up already into Iowa, Illinois even. So a very moist air mass over a broad region here. That is going to lead to a very broad, long durations severe threat with the potential for multiple rounds of significant severe storms here traversing these same regions. Greatest moisture, of course, down here across the Oklahoma-Texas region up into southern Kansas. That will spread northward with time today. How this morning convection influences this environment is going to be key with this setup. We will see the northward advance of the warm front, probably up to somewhere in here across northern Kansas, perhaps even far southern Nebraska, going into the morning, late morning, early afternoon hours. So those mid to upper 60s dew points will make their way northward. However, this convection forming in the Texas Panhandle is going to track off that way as well. So we may see a little bit of an area south of the front and east of the dry line where we will see a little bit of a pocket of worked over air mass. But south of that, again, where we see that set up is going to be our area for perhaps convective outflow to set up, as well as a differential heating boundary that could set up. And that could be our favorite corridor for significant severe weather today. And where that sets up is going to be critical to watch going into the afternoon hours today. Here are some soundings this morning here. This is the Norman, Oklahoma sounding from 12Z, and this is about as textbook as it gets on the morning of a severe weather event. Loaded gun sounding, at least on the thermodynamic side of things. Fairly deep moisture here, extending up above 850 millibars beneath a pretty stout elevated mix layer here. 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer plus lapse rates there in that layer with some drier air just located above that elevated, or above that low-level moist layer. Classic look here leading to a loaded gun sounding. And it's not going to take much to overcome this capping inversion, only about negative 22 convective inhibition at this point. So very limited convective inhibition at this point, and that is going to allow for this early round to get going here eventually. Let's check in with that here at the moment. You see they're starting to percolate here, perk up a little bit across that I-40 corridor in the eastern Texas Panhandle, some here in western Oklahoma as well. They will continue to perk up here probably over the next several hours. Not going to take much as we get just a little bit of surface heating perhaps to erode this capping inversion. You can see the satellite here across the region. Here is our storm complex that is developing, and lots of breaks in the clouds already across this region. You see plenty of breaks in the clouds for lots of sunshine here. That will allow that cap to really be gone by very early in this event, and that will lead to a second round of storms to initiate very quickly along the dry line and south of the warm front after the morning round moves through. And as that forcing moves in, we're going to see rapid supercell development along the associated boundaries, given a very weak cap in place. Weak cap also means perhaps that we will see a lot of storms go up at once. We'll talk about storm mode a little bit more in a second, perhaps looking a little bit more favorable for a discrete supercell window today. But we probably will have a lot of storms going up. And so we will probably see a lot of storm interactions today. And that could also aid in the tornado threat, but it is going to be a little bit of a difficult chase for those chasing today, as we're going to see a lot of interactions between these supercells and a lot of supercells that will fire in this environment. But very much a loaded gun environment thermodynamically. Textbook look, already 2,600 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. That is extremely high for this early in the morning. At 7 a.m. that this sounding was taken. And so ample instability already in place here across Oklahoma, and that is only expected to increase as we go into the afternoon. Kinematically, already favorable for severe weather. We see strong deep layer shear for supercells, 40 knots or so of effective bulk shear. Some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, not too much. Again, the low-level jet is expected to wane a little bit into the late morning, early afternoon hours before ramping up again in the late afternoon hours. So we will see a little bit of a decrease in effective storm relative helicity here, but for now, certainly seeing plenty of storm relative helicity favorable for a tornado threat with these early storms, and then transitioning to more of a hail threat with this convection, and then the second round of convection firing in the early afternoon hours today. But a fairly textbook look for early in a severe weather event. Down to the south, much of the same here at Fort Worth. Very similar looking sounding, loaded gun type profile. Up here to the north, let's take one here at Springfield, Missouri. Much of the same, not quite as favorable a look, not as much instability at this point, but that will change going into the afternoon hours today, especially across southeast Kansas, with a little bit of an elevated mixed layer there, somewhat of a moist layer, but plenty of shear for a severe threat up there. Up here across Illinois, you see that our kinematics are pretty strong already in that northern corridor just south of that front. Strong low-level shear, strong deep layer shear for supercells, but again, that forcing is going to move off to the northeast away from this region through the day. So we may see a little bit of a minimum in deep layer shear here, but we could see that all hazardous threat develop in somewhat of a clustered mode along the frontal zone that will be draped here across southeast Nebraska into Iowa, Wisconsin, perhaps southeast Minnesota in the afternoon today. But down here in the southern plains, a primed look for significant severe weather. All right, let's look at some model data. This is the 6Z NAM, doing this a little bit earlier once again this morning, so the 12Z NAM is not quite out yet as I'm recording this, but the 6Z NAM should do just fine. Here is our trough at 500 millibars, big old trough here, making its way into the central and southern plains today. One interesting feature here is that you see most of the strongest flow is still relegated to the backside of this trough, so the trough is still strengthening, and it is going to continue to do so as we go into the afternoon. You see the progression of this trough. That flow starts to round the base of the trough when you see a nice plume of that stronger flow impinge upon the exit region of this trough as it moves into the central and southern plains this afternoon. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time today. Nice little jet streak there impinging upon the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, southern Kansas. So plenty of forcing here into the mid-afternoon hours to get that second round of storms to go. And then as we go into the evening hours tonight, that trough takes on a very nice negative tilt, ejecting off to the northeast, and we'll see that continued severe threat tomorrow as it does that. Down at the surface, let's see how the surface pattern is expected to play out. So here's our initial surface low off to the north with the setup that we had Thursday and Friday. That will continue to move off to the northeast today. And then we'll have the secondary surface low develop here across the southeast Colorado vicinity into the panhandles. You can see it's already, once again, started to at least broadly develop this morning, and that will continue to tighten up as we go through the day. You see by about 15, 18Z, this is 1 p.m., very tight surface low developing across that Oklahoma Panhandle corridor. Out off to the 4 p.m. hour, still the same tightening surface low there across that region. Not going to move a whole lot. And this is also a favorable thing for this severe weather threat, is that our main features of interest are close to the region. They're very close in proximity to the region. Surface low is not up here in Nebraska, Wyoming, or something, and we're just left with the dry line to force these storms. The surface low here in close proximity to our warm sector here across Oklahoma, southern Kansas, northwest Texas. So therefore, we'll have an extra oomph, if you will, from the surface low to get storms to go this afternoon and evening, along with the trough that is overspreading the warm sector and that stronger flow and forcing overspreading the warm sector this afternoon. But again, a broad warm sector. You can see where that front is off to the north, up into the Great Lakes region, extending down from that the initial surface low down there. It does somewhat lift into southeast Nebraska, northern Kansas, and then down to the south dry line here across western Oklahoma. You can see our dew points outline that pretty clearly. Broad swath of 60s dew points already in place across the region this morning. That front going to lift northward ever so slightly with time. The northeast portions of that front not going to lift all that significantly here until about late afternoon when we see that surface low really start to tighten. You can see the hole in the dew points here across northwest Oklahoma into southern Kansas. That is associated with this first round of convection. As that first round of convection spreads northward, again to the south of that, we will see probably some sort of differential heating outflow boundary type deal, and that will be our favorite corridor for severe storms, oriented probably very well to allow these storms to track along it and produce that significant tornado threat given increased low-level shear. But this hole in the dew points definitely associated with this morning round of convection that will move off into Kansas, and in the wake we're not expecting to see a lot here until that early afternoon round, and that is why we've seen a little bit of a change here in the forecast for this morning. We're not sure over the last couple of days how this morning convection would play out, expecting to see probably a lot of convection across Oklahoma into Texas. That is looking less likely at this point, just looking at where these storms are setting up here across western Oklahoma, the eastern Texas panhandle. They're going to move off this way, leaving much of Oklahoma to the south and southeast of this line unsullied, that atmosphere here unsullied by this morning round of storms. So that has been one of the main changes with this forecast, and it has unfortunately been a change toward a more favorable setup for severe weather across southeast Kansas into Oklahoma and northwest Texas. So that is how the morning convection is expected to evolve off into Kansas, but we see very quick recovery behind it, 60 to 70 dew points to the south of that boundary, and then we should see a line where we see multiple supercells fire along this dry line. Very tight dry line at that, I will mention. And it does kind of move off to the east before retreating back to the west just a tad before the cold front comes in overnight and pushes it off to the east a little bit perhaps. But here we are at 21Z, very tight looking dry line here across the Oklahoma-Texas border region with just a little bit of a bulge there in southwest Oklahoma. That could be a favored corridor for supercell development down there, tracking along that I-44 corridor, the famous tornado path there up into the OKC Metro. Cannot stress enough, the Oklahoma City Metro today needs to take their weather safety precautions as this could be a significant day for a lot of folks in the path here, including in the OKC Metro. Quickly, let's take a look at storm mode here. Again, as we said, weak capping should allow for quite a few storms to go, but we do see a pretty good degree of perpendicularity with the deep layer shear vectors with respect to the dry line, especially here across Oklahoma and Kansas. Down here in Texas, a little bit more of a parallel nature with those shear vectors with regards to the boundary, but up here in Oklahoma, quite a nice angle off the boundary for these storms. So we could see a little bit more of a discrete mode up here from Oklahoma into southern Kansas, and that could, again, a discrete mode is what is needed for these long track significant tornadoes. So that is certainly a trend that we have not liked to see as well for the folks in the path of these storms. And yesterday and a couple of recent model runs had a little bit worse angle between the dry line, the initiating boundary, and the shear vectors, but that is not really the case as I'm seeing here on the NAM, as these shear vectors are nicely off the boundary and should provide for a window for discrete to semi-discrete supercells, even though there will be a lot of them and probably a lot of interactions among them. So that is something that is a little bit worrisome for this corridor. Let's take a couple of soundings here. It might be a little bit difficult on the NAM. It looks like there's a lot of convection here across central Oklahoma, but I'm going to do my best to find a sounding. Let's take one right there, 18Z. We'll start early here across Oklahoma. And then we're right at OKC down into northwest Texas, and then we'll take one up here along the warm front up into eastern Kansas. Not going to focus too much on the northeast thread up there in the Great Lakes region down into kind of the Midwest. We're going to focus here on our greatest area for severe storm coverage today. So this is what we have, 18Z NAM at Oklahoma City. Already a very favorable environment for an all hazards threat. Again, you see that low level jet wane just a little bit going into the early afternoon hours, and that will allow for kind of a transition to a large hail threat. Still a threat for maybe a tornado or two with initial activity, but that large hail threat should take place as these storms start to mature. I do suspect at 21Z, let me take a sounding here at 21Z at Oklahoma City. And just real quick to compare, I do suspect that we will see a little bit of a decrease perhaps. No, that's not the case. Very convectively contaminated there. Trying to find a sounding here away from this convection that the NAM has modeled. You can see the NAM is modeling quite a bit of convection. And so, yeah, we see a kind of unidirectional flow in the lowest kilometer or so, but very strong turning there by 21Z in these profiles. This is at 18Z, 21Z. The atmosphere continues to destabilize, 3,000 plus joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE there. So strong instability. CAP will be gone by this point, fully destabilized, fairly deep moisture as well. This is all in all a classic thermodynamic profile for a significant severe weather outbreak. One other thing to mention here, this is again at 21Z, 4 p.m. here at Oklahoma City. Do have pretty strong turning in the lowest couple of kilometers of the atmosphere favorable for that tornado threat, and lots of streamwise vorticity. That's when we have your storm relative wind vector and your horizontal vorticity vector, which is perpendicular and to the left of the hodograph. When those are parallel, you have strong streamwise vorticity, and we have almost perfectly parallel there in the lowest levels of the hodograph, meaning that we have that's going to make it a lot easier for these storms to produce tornadoes today, especially as interactions come with strong streamwise vorticity. But one thing to note here with the kinematics is this is a very southeast-esque profile. Not so much that we don't have mega low-level shear perhaps, but notice how the hodograph kind of folds around on itself here to make kind of an upside-down U shape. That is a pretty classic southeast type sounding, and what that's going to do is that may make viewing these tornadoes today somewhat difficult. As you have here, we've done this before, you have your mesocyclone region here, and then we can trace the mid and upper levels of the storm based on our wind profile here, and you can see that the precipitation would be vented out ahead of the mesocyclone region of these storms here, and that would allow for a very perhaps difficult viewing process with these storms, as rain will get shunted out in front of these tornadoes. So you're going to have to be pretty close, probably south or southeast of these storms, of the mesocyclone region of these storms, and perhaps very close to these storms to see any tornadic activity. This is a very southeast type sounding as well, or a hodograph or wind profile as well. And as we know, southeast tornadoes are often shrouded in rain, and this is often why you'll have the upper level winds kind of shunting the precipitation out in front of the mesos of these supercells. So could make it a very dangerous day to view these storms, but overall strong instability, 3,000 plus joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, with strong low level shear here, strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height. That will allow for plenty of low-level storm relative helicity, effective helicity, almost up to 300 meters squared per second squared. So that will foster that strong tornado threat there going into the afternoon hours. So that was at Oklahoma City there. This is at Northwest Texas, 18Z. Not as favorable of a hodograph, still plenty of instability, but that would foster more of a large hail threat given somewhat limited low-level shear. And then up into Kansas ahead of that complex, moving there, very limited low-level shear as well, with more lengthy hodographs, more straight hodographs, favorable for that large hail threat, perhaps with that initial round of storms as it moves into Kansas. 21Z here, let's take a sounding here. We saw the Oklahoma City one, or the one there in southern Oklahoma. How about one here up into eastern Kansas, as that initial round could continue and continue to foster that all hazards threat. Down there in Texas, not all that favorable there of a hodograph, very limited extent there. So the stronger flow is definitely going to be up to the north with more lengthy hodographs. Up there in Kansas, definitely a large hail threat there with limited low-level shear ahead of that initial round. Then we go to 0Z. We continue here. Take one just east of OKC, hopefully not ruined by convection there. But the NAM, you can see, is kind of progging a lot of convection here. Wow. And this is why we're talking about a significant outbreak going into the late afternoon and early evening hours. This is about as textbook as it gets here. Strong instability, steep lapse rates aloft, 3,000 plus joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, fat instability, fat low-level instability as well, 170 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE. So lots of instability shunted to those lower levels of the hodograph, indicating strong low-level updrafts and stretching of any vorticity and spin near the surface. This is just an absolutely textbook sounding for a significant tornado event here. Looking at this, looking at the potential for discrete supercells, I would not be surprised if we see a small high risk introduced here at some point today. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but man, this is shaping up to be a pretty significant event, especially in that window from mid to late afternoon into early evening. We may still have discrete supercells ongoing because this wind profile, look at that wind profile. Strong low-level shear here, intense curvature of the hodograph, strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height. You can see that low-level flow strengthens to about 60 knots here, low-level jet-wise. Upwards of 400 plus meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. With this kind of instability, that is a recipe for a nasty event. Once again, you see though that the winds aloft are kind of venting that precipitation out ahead of the storms here. So that may make viewing again pretty difficult. So if you're northeast of these storms, you may not be able to see them very well, which may make chasing them and viewing them fairly difficult. But overall, a very potent look there by early evening across parts of central Oklahoma for a significant tornado threat. Let's go now to some high resolution models. This is the 12Z HRRR here. So hot off the press 12Z HRRR. And you can see it has progged the initial convection fairly well. Starts to intensify, lots of stronger cores in there as it moves off to the northeast. We get some supercell development within that band by about 18, 19Z here, perhaps earlier, but lots of large hail threat, pretty much a large hail threat. And then look at that, by 2021Z, multiple discrete supercells in this line developing along the dry line in a kind of a broken band up here from southern Kansas into northwest Texas. Multiple discrete supercells continuing on for several hours there. You can see some interactions, though, start to take place there by late afternoon. So how fast the mode starts to degrade a little bit here will be how long we'll see that discrete supercell and therefore that significant long track tornado threat materialize. Because we do see a fairly quick transition to a line across Oklahoma. Certainly would have several opportunities for embedded circulations within this line and perhaps continue, but anywhere where we can see more discrete supercells, that those would take advantage of the long track tornadic supercell profile more so to increase that significant tornado threat there. So that is a pretty potent look there, 21Z, 4 p.m. As the low-level jet is increasing, those discrete supercells continue on. And then eventually we'll see just a congealing of a lot of convection here. Strong squall line making its way across Oklahoma and Texas with the chance for embedded tornadoes and significant damaging winds. Let's go off to the north here real quick. Show you kind of the northern sector of this risk. So here's that morning activity, moves off into Kansas, very messy mode up here, but does kind of devolve into some supercells, it looks like, into southern Kansas there by mid-afternoon or so. Some activity up here along the front, northern Missouri, southern Iowa, and that continues into the evening. Back here as well, looking at the potential for maybe a couple supercells back into Colorado near the surface low, just north of the surface low and somewhat of an upslope regime. Very limited moisture up here, but it is eastern Colorado, so higher terrain going to help with that. And we could see a couple supercells with tornadoes and large hail up there in the eastern Colorado, western Kansas vicinity. But our main threat, of course, going to come from these dryline storms here. That they will pose that significant all hazards threat. Then going into the evening, things kind of congeal into a line by early evening, and then we'll see the damaging wind and embedded tornado threat ramp up into the overnight hours. We don't have a lot of the other models left in yet, and so I don't really want to take a look at those because they did not handle morning convection all that well. So we're going to hold off on those. We can look at the FV3. I don't like looking at the FV3 as it does tend to overdo convection in these regimes, but we can just look at it to see. It does not have a lot of the morning storms here, so that's an immediate reason why you can take this with a grain of salt. But it does foster semi-discrete supercells and does hold them on for quite a while here into the afternoon, multiple rounds into the early evening hours, tracking across central Oklahoma, southeast Kansas. So all in all, storms are a certainty today. Multiple rounds of storms are a certainty today, unlike a couple of our past events, perhaps, for example, on Thursday, where storm initiation was a lot more conditional. That is not the case today. We have plenty of ingredients to force these storms to go, so there will be supercells across this corridor, and they will have the potential for significant severe hazards. So that's going to do it for today's video. Again, a very potent setup is setting up across the central and southern plains today, particularly in the moderate risk region. Again, I would not be surprised. We'll see what they do with the 11:30 outlook. but I would not be surprised to see a small high risk here at some point. But just given the parameter space going into the early evening hours tonight, if any discrete supercells can hold on, that will foster a significant long track, perhaps strong to violent tornado threat across this corridor. But for now, moderate risk has been issued southeast Kansas into the central corridor of Oklahoma down into northwest Texas. So places just east of Wichita. So, Fredonia, Chanute, Kansas, down into northeast Oklahoma, Bartlesville, Tulsa, Owasso, down into central Oklahoma, Oklahoma City Metro. Everyone in the Oklahoma City Metro needs to be on alert today for that significant all hazards threat. OKC, Norman, Shawnee, down toward Lawton, Fort Sill, Ardmore, the WinStar Casino, Wichita Falls. Folks in those areas and in between in the red shaded region here under the gun for the greatest severe weather risk today, and that will include the threat for all severe hazards, perhaps significant. Again, the enhanced risk extends up to the warm front there, southeast Nebraska, southwest Iowa, western Missouri, up into Kansas. Here, probably going to be a little bit of an issue with that morning round of storms. Probably will intensify as it goes into the afternoon, but probably a more messy mode up here, perhaps for more of a damaging wind and large hail threat, with some tornado threat in there as well. Strong deep layer shear and low level shear as well up here, but the storm mode may be a little bit more clustered up there, closer to the warm front. A couple storms may fire here in eastern Colorado in that slight risk with that all hazard threat as well. And then up here along the frontal zone into the Great Lakes region. Could see a few severe storms there with all hazards, but more of a clustered mode up there, given a lack of forcing for a set. But down here in the central and southern plains is where our greatest severe weather threat and a potential significant severe weather outbreak and tornado outbreak is forecast for today. 15% hashed tornado risk there within the red stippled area, large 10% hashed area around that. Again, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Lawton, Wichita Falls, even Dallas, Abilene, Kansas City, Wichita under the gun for that greatest tornado threat today. That does include the threat for significant long track, perhaps strong to violent tornadoes in this environment, particularly across that central Oklahoma corridor. Large hail also going to be a threat as well, perhaps in the initial initial convective life cycle before the low-level jet ramps up this evening to foster that significant tornado threat. But a very broad region of large to very large to giant hail possible from southwest Iowa into Colorado, down to the south along the dry line into southwest Texas, particularly centered in this 45% hashed area across southeast Kansas, Oklahoma, and northwest Texas. Damaging wind also going to be a threat, especially as storms congeal into the overnight hours. Wouldn't be surprised to see an upgrade here in the wind potential, given a very expansive, very significant squall line moving across from the Midwest down into the central and southern plains going into the overnight hours tonight. But for now, 30% hatched area for significant damaging wind gusts, 70, 80 plus miles an hour there in the red hatched area there. So folks in these regions, particularly in the orange and really the red region here across southeast Kansas, central Oklahoma, into northwest Texas, have those weather radios handy today, have that source of weather, have multiple sources of weather information, multiple ways to get warnings, have a plan. If you live in a mobile home, have a sturdy shelter you can go to if a tornado warning is issued for your area, or even a tornado watch. Just head out, get to a sturdy shelter well ahead of time, as today is not a day to mess around with, as these tornadoes may be difficult to see. They may be wrapped in rain, and they may be coming at you pretty fast. So have that plan in place, as this is a very high-end day. It could end up being a very high-end day across the central and southern plains. So with that, everybody stay safe out there today. Folks in the path of these storms and chasers out there today, stay safe. Please, if it gets too dicey, have that plan to get out of the way and get to more safe shelter, as this is going to be a pretty intense day. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.